Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. I'm your host, David Fenton. You know, there have been other really bad periods of American history just as depressing, just as corrupt as now. And my guest today, historian and journalist Adam Hochschild, is an expert in these previous periods of suffering and corruption and how we got out of them, as we will again, without a doubt. Adam's book, American Midnight, for example, one of his many history books, shows how in the World War I period, Woodrow Wilson and his attorney general arrested over 10,000 activists in a roundup called the Palmer Raids. And he talks about the anti-immigrant fervor that swept the country and how immigration was cut off, which helped cause the Holocaust because Jews couldn't come here. Sound familiar? We've been there before, folks, and we will get out of it again. Over to my interview with historian Adam Hochschild.
Power to the people! Power to the people!
So, Adam, you recently said that this is among the most perilous, perhaps the most perilous and grimmest moment of your 55-year career of things that you've seen. What did you mean by that? Tell us about that.
I'm afraid it's a little more than 55 years, but we're at a very scary time because we have somebody in charge of the United States government, the President of the United States right now, who is totally devoted to his own glory at the expense of everything else. The rule of law, conflicts of interest, forget about it. What he cares about is his own glory, making money for himself, his family, and his friends, and taking revenge upon his enemies. And this is what drives Donald Trump. And it's not what should be driving the president of a country like the United States. We've seen just so many different ways in which, the Justice Department has been turned into an instrument of Trump's revenge on his political enemies. It's his criterion for who he appoints to office. His new nominee to be Director of National Intelligence, who's going to be acting in that position, because it's going to be difficult for him to get confirmed, has no background in intelligence whatsoever. But he has a track record of persecuting and prosecuting Trump's enemies. That's what matters to him. And we're in a world where we need good intelligence. I mean, we are up against countries like Russia, like China, that are trying to do bad things. And I want somebody in that job who is going to protect the United States and protect what legitimacy is left in the American system. So I think, and the list could go on for why it's such a dangerous moment. I think the way Trump, in conjunction with Israel, started this war in Iran is a, great illustration of that. There was no planning. There was no gaming. There was no looking at the very obvious fact that Iran would retaliate by closing the Strait of Hormuz, send oil prices soaring all over the world, which is affecting people, and especially poor people, in countries everywhere. They didn't stop to think about that because Trump's way of acting is extremely impulsive, extremely self-centered. He's convinced that when he has decided something, it's the best decision.
Yeah, he's very grandiose, but we've had other periods in American history that were corrupt. We've had other presidents that had authoritarian tendencies. We had other presidents that had periods of terrible repression. You've written about them. So what's worse about this compared to these other eras? Or even what you and I lived through with Nixon and the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, things were pretty bad then too.
They were. Well, let's compare where we are now to two of these earlier periods. The Nixon period, which we did live through, and the period that I wrote about in my book, American Midnight, 1917 to 1921, which I think does remain the most politically repressive period in American
Which
history.
people know so little about.
It's true. But just the Nixon period, there's no question that Nixon was a headstrong, ambitious president who also would like to have taken revenge on his political enemies. But our checks and balances functioned a little bit better then. The Senate started investigating him. The Senate Watergate investigation, turned up a whole host of illegal things that he did, and eventually forced him to resign. A process that was started by investigative journalism by Woodward and Bernstein at the Washington Post. It was picked up by the Senate. There were honest people in the Justice Department who came forward, and in a sense, the system worked at that time. I believe the late Jonathan Schell in the New Yorker once used the phrase, the long hand of the founding fathers reached forward and these checks and balances worked. I think Trump is aware of that. He's aware of what happened to Richard Nixon, and he's trying to make damn sure nothing like that happens to him, and to make sure that the government and the judiciary at every level is stocked with people whose loyalty is to him, not to the United States, not to the Constitution, but to him personally. And there is a venom and a determination with vast funding behind it in the way that he's gone after Republicans who agree with 95% of what he's done, but there's somebody else running in a Republican primary who is backing him 100%, and he'll put millions of dollars
Along with Elon Musk and other Silicon Valley people.
Right. And along with AIPAC in many cases as well. So this is something we haven't seen before. I do think in some ways, though, we're better off than we were during that earlier repressive period.
Under Woodrow Wilson.
Under Woodrow Wilson. I mean, let's just review what happened then.
Which people would, I think would benefit hearing, because we've had other bad periods before people.
We have. But this period that I covered in American Midnight, I'm fascinated by the way it gets left out of history books, because you remember your high school American history textbook. There was a chapter on the First World War. The doughboys went to Europe in those forest ranger hats. They helped win the war. They came home. They were welcomed by cheering crowds. Then that chapter's over. And then the next chapter begins, which is the Roaring Twenties, Babe Ruth, Prohibition, speakeasies, and all of that. What gets left out is that slice of time in between. And here's what happened then. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, entered the First World War, it set off a frenzy of hyperpatriotism. Entering a major war always does strange things to a country. And this was a country that was somewhat divided over whether it should fight in this war. 50 members of the House of Representatives voted against going to war, 6 members of the Senate.
World War I.
World War I. In 1917, they were ostracized. Robert La Follette, who was the most outspoken anti-war Senate, was hanged in effigy on the campus that was his alma mater, University of Wisconsin. His fellow senators opened an inquiry into whether he should be expelled from the U.S. Senate for taking this position, for opposing the war. The government was frantic that opposition to the war would cause them problems with the military. And this was also a convenient excuse to intervene against unions and against strikes, because suddenly these workers on strike could be accused of interfering with the war effort. So there was a fierce crackdown on organized labor in this period. Then later in 1917, April 1917, the U.S. joined the war. In November came the Russian Revolution. And many in the American establishment were petrified that that might spread to the United States. So that provided a further motive for the government to crack down on people. Here's some of the things they did. Woodrow Wilson rammed through Congress the Espionage Act, which gave the government the power to do several different things. One of them was to essentially throw anybody in jail. They could be subject to up to 20 years in prison and a big fine for interfering with the war effort.
Vaguely defined.
Very vaguely defined. And under the Espionage Act and under copycat legislation that many states passed, even cities passed. Berkeley, California, where we live, had an ordinance like this.
Oh my
The
goodness.
state of California had a law like this. During that 4 or 5 year period, roughly 1,000 Americans spent a year or more in prison, and a much larger number, shorter periods of time, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody did anything violent in that period, because there were some anarchists who planted bombs and so on, but these were people jailed solely for things they wrote or said. The most famous of them was Eugene Debs, the perennial socialist candidate for president, who won 6% of the popular vote in 1912, sentenced to prison for 10 years for a speech he'd given at a bandstand at a park in Canton, Ohio. The most famous example was Eugene Debs, who had several times been the socialist candidate for president. He won 6% of the popular vote in 1912. He was sent to prison for 10 years solely for a speech he gave opposing the war from a bandstand in a park in Canton, Ohio. Debs was a very nonviolent man, committed to refrain from violence in democracy every way, and to democracy. Bam, 10 years in
Didn't he
prison.
run for president from jail?
He did. 2 years later, he was still in jail in November 1920 for the presidential election that year, and won nearly 1 million votes from his cell in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So that was one bit of repression that happened in that time. All these people sent to prison
For what they said and wrote.
solely for what they said.
Union organizers, intellectuals, anti-war activists,
Right.
rounded up and imprisoned for their thoughts and writings.
Yeah. And supposedly because they were interfering with the war effort, but a surprising number of these people happened to be officials in the Socialist Party, activists in labor unions, and so on. Another facet of the repression was that the Espionage Act, which Congress passed in 1917, gave the Postmaster General the power to stop from going through the mail any publication that was deemed to be interfering with the war effort. And
Which could just mean criticizing the war.
right. Or even he continued to wield that power after the war stopped.
Yeah.
And between the passage of the Espionage Act and the end of the Wilson administration in March of 1921, the Postmaster General, who was a terrible guy,
A hack, as I recall.
who loved being chief censor, removed roughly 400 specific issues of American newspapers and magazines from the mail, and shut down 75 newspapers and magazines
Wow.
entirely.
Because back then, if you couldn't mail it, people couldn't get it.
Exactly.
Right.
There was no email, no internet, no other way of distributing a national publication.
Was The Nation one of those magazines that was banned?
No, it was, I believe certain issues were censored. It was not banned. The most famous one that was banned was a magazine called The Masses, which was in many ways the best magazine in the country. It published Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, John Reed. It had a mixture of fiction, poetry, reportage,
Right.
very much sort of a precursor of the New Yorker.
And it did exposés on big corporate trusts, as I recall.
It did
Was
expose.
it Tarbo that she wrote for the Masses?
No,
That was
she
later.
was a little bit earlier, actually. But John Reed wrote a lot for the Masses. They shut it down because in August 1917, it had an issue with a lot of things that the censor didn't like, one of which was a cartoon of the Liberty Bell crumbling.
Oh,
So
So the postmaster could censor a magazine for a cartoon.
yes,
That's American history,
for
folks.
whatever he wanted. And
And that's only 110 years ago.
and supposedly this was all to do with the war effort. When the war ended, Woodrow Wilson told the Postmaster General, Albert Burleson was his name, we can really stop the censorship now. The war is over. But Burleson paid no attention and kept on shutting down newspapers and magazines right up until March 1921. And a third facet of the repression in that era was that there were militia groups that were very active, beating up labor organizers, beating up people at anti-war demonstrations and so on, quite violently. The largest of them was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice, something called the American Protective League, 250,000 members. So this was a nasty
Basically a
period.
vigilante army.
Right. Now, I think we're a little better off in some ways today because we don't have the equivalent of these widespread vigilante organizations. We did see vigilantes in action January 6th,
The Proud
2021,
Boys, etc.
but
Oath Keepers.
they're not going around smashing heads right now. We do have ICE and the Border Patrol out there doing a lot of this stuff.
What about the Palmer Raids?
Well, that was also something that happened in this period where Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer was very eager to be the Democratic candidate for president in 1920. He used his power as Attorney General to jail a lot of leftists. And then in late 1919, early 1920, he staged what are known as the Palmer Raids, where they arrested some 10,000 people who were leftists, but who had not bothered to get American citizenship. This was something people often didn't fuss about at a time when the country seemed to be welcoming
where it was huge waves of immigration
huge
from
waves
Europe
of
into the United
immigration.
States, right?
Or people didn't speak English well, and so they didn't bother getting regulars. So he arrested all these people, hoping to deport them and deport them conspicuously in a way that would help his presidential.
Sounds familiar.
So it was a nasty period.
And Emma Goldman was one of those people. Is that right?
He was actually deported before the Palmer Raids.
And she was an important progressive labor activist of that period.
Very, very outspoken
Writer.
feminist, anarchist.
Yeah.
So
they rounded up 10,000 people and kept them in jail awaiting deportation.
They did. Happily, Palmer got foiled in his plans because there was a very alert bureaucrat in an important position, somebody that Donald Trump would call a member of the deep state, a wonderful man named Louis Post, who was acting Secretary of Labor. And deportations, arrests of people were done by the Justice Department, which Palmer controlled, but deportations had to be under the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Labor Department. Post was a good guy, a longtime progressive journalist who felt very strongly he was not an anarchist or socialist himself, but he felt very strongly no one should be deported because of his or her political opinions. He was also a very skillful bureaucrat and lawyer, and managed to invalidate arrest warrants, release people from prison, and less than a tenth of those 10,000 people were actually deported.
And now you have Marco Rubio trying to deport people for their political views and writings.
I know, this stuff just comes around again. But I'll tell you why I think we're a little better off right now. I do think the country has a deeper appreciation of the First Amendment than was the case 110 years ago. And I think we have a less compliant media, despite the pressure that Trump is exerting on CBS and so forth. When you pick up the New York Times today, you see all of these atrocities detailed at great lengths. You see a lot of good investigative reporting there, in other newspapers, in other media on the internet. When you read newspapers from 1917, 1918, they all go along quite passively, with very rare exceptions, with what the government.
Kind of like the way the New York Times went along with the Vietnam War.
Yes, up to a point.
And helped spark the Iraq invasion.
Right, by Judith Miller writing about how we're guaranteed a victory there over.
And of course, we now have the problem that most people don't read newspapers. They're getting their information from these influencers on the internet. You know, the idea of responsible mediation to ensure some fealty to actual facts is, you know, Mark Zuckerberg has kind of gotten rid of that. So yes, there's good journalism, but the quality of the information that most people are getting today is, you know, very inconsistent, very spotty.
That's true. But I also have to say there are good influencers out there. You know, Heather Cox Richardson has something like 3 or 4 million subscribers.
She's terrific.
Robert Reich, you know, who communicates in many different media. It has an enormous audience.
So it's not the same as back then, that's for sure.
So I think the media is better. Something else that's better is the courts. Despite the fact that we have a horrendous Supreme Court right now, that has just finished gutting the Voting Rights Act and has done many other horrible things as well. I don't think that today's Supreme Court would have done what the Supreme Court in early 1919 did, which was to unanimously uphold the Espionage Act. An interesting thing happened that year, though. And this was the act, as we were saying, that allowed the government to put people in prison, to censor newspapers and magazines, you know, just by saying, you know, this is questioning the war effort. Supreme Court unanimously upheld it early 1919, when the war was over, incidentally. Later that year, a different case involving the act came before the court again, and one Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., had second thoughts. He told his colleagues he was not going to vote to uphold the Espionage Act. And 3 of them were so alarmed, they came to see him in his home and said, you know, Oliver, you really have to join us in making this unanimous. And be a good soldier. Holmes was a wounded veteran of the Civil War, and his sword from the Civil War hung on the wall where they were having this conversation. And he said, no, I believe the act is wrong. I've changed my mind on this. We know what was said because his law clerk was listening in from the next room. And Louis Brandeis joined him in that dissent. So this time around, late 1919, the Espionage Act was only upheld by 7-2.
It's still on the books, the Espionage Act.
It's still on the
They've
books.
limited some of it.
They've amended it a lot. Oddly enough, it was under the Espionage Act that Donald Trump was charged with having these classified documents at Mar-a-Lago.
Right.
So I think, and I must say also, in today's America, the lower courts, you know, the district courts and the federal courts of appeal have mostly been pretty good during this difficult period.
We're not in full-blown authoritarianism. The courts are still playing a role, even though the top court is so corrupt and so partisan. It's shameful.
It is.
For a long time, America was welcoming immigrants from Europe into this country, and then that shifted, and there was a crackdown, and immigration was stopped. Tell us about how that happened.
Well, you know, there's a long history of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. We are a country of immigrants. There's very few of us, unless, you know, one is absolutely pure-blooded Native American who doesn't have immigrant background. You know, my ancestors arrived here in the 19th century, and many friends whose ancestors have come later. But the form that our anti-immigrant feeling is taken is almost always those whose ancestors got here like 2 generations earlier get upset about people who are arriving now and from a different part of the world. So today, the venom is directed at people, primarily people coming from Latin America over the southern border. And, my goodness, people from Africa are sneaking in over the southern border as well. A century ago, villainous immigrants were different. They were primarily Italians and Jews. These were the people that the anti-immigrant people of that generation really disliked. And that sentiment was building really from the 1880s, 1890s onward, which was when the big surge of immigration to the United States began. One of the things that ignited that was the assassination of the Russian Tsar in 1881, Alexander II, who was the reformer czar, the man who freed the serfs, who was not a human rights activist, but he was notably less anti-Semitic than other members of his family. And as soon as he was
that ignite any immigrant fervor here?
Well, it meant a huge number of Russian Jews
left
came to the United States in the 2 decades after that.
Yeah, like my family, which came in 1905 to avoid the Tsar's draft in the Sino-Japanese War.
Pogroms that were going on at that time too.
Yeah.
Because that
that went on for hundreds of years.
It did, but they accelerated after the Tsar's assassination. So
more Jews came, more Italians came, and a sentiment shifted against them.
And a lot of Poles as well.
Right.
And the U.S. at that time was very much controlled by an Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. And they were appalled at, this number of Jews, number of Catholics pouring into the country. And the anti-immigrant movement was very much a sort of Anglo-Saxon.
So when did they cut it off?
It was finally cut off in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, which is a fascinating piece of legislation because up to that point, there had been relatively few restrictions on immigration, and sometimes more than 1 million immigrants a year arriving. But when they fashioned this act in 1924, it didn't cut off immigration completely, but it restricted it to a very small quota of people, and that quota was determined by what percentage of the American population had come from that country or that ethnic group. However, the quota system was determined not by the American population of the census of 1920, which showed large numbers of Jews, Poles, and Italians, just the kind of people these folks didn't want to let in, but the American census of 1890, which was before those numbers had gotten so large. So it was fashioned specifically to, keep such people out of the country. And the people where the quotas, the groups where the quotas were larger, people immigrating from Great Britain or Holland or whatever, were not countries that were swept by pogroms or poverty that large people wanted to come from.
Yeah.
It was that act of 1924 which kept out all but a fairly small number of refugees from the Holocaust.
Right. This is what contributed to the Holocaust, that the Jews were not allowed to come to America. Immigration was cut off. Even as the war started and we began to know about what Hitler was doing to the Jews, they would not allow them in. So this anti-immigrant fervor, dirty Italians, dirty Jews, led directly to millions of people being killed overseas.
Yeah, I'm convinced, and I actually recently wrote a piece saying this as a sort of trial alternative history, that if we had never passed the 1924 Immigration Act, it would have lessened the toll of the Holocaust, and it also might have made things easier for the Palestinians.
Right.
Because it would have lessened the number of people wanting to
go there,
immigrate to Palestine. If the 1924 Act had not been there, I think Jews would have continued to flow from Europe to the United States because even before Hitler came to power, Poland, which had the largest number of Jews in Europe, almost 3 million, was a cauldron of anti Semitism with all sorts of laws, restrictions, quotas, sometimes violence in the streets. People would have continued to come from there, I think.
Right.
And I think that would have lessened the pressure of immigrants to Palestine. And had that been the case, in my alternative history, maybe Jews and Arabs would have been able to find a better way of sharing that part of the world in which they both have such deep roots. We would also, I think, have to give both Jews and Arabs their more enlightened leaders than either people had at that time, who were more inclined to compromise and coexistence.
True. Well, just briefly, I wanted to touch on that. You wrote about this recently in the New York Review of Books. People don't know, but there is a big tradition in Judaism against Zionism.
Yeah.
And in fact, there were Jewish organizations that specifically opposed creating a Jewish state in Israel. It was a raging debate. Briefly, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this I mostly learned from the book that I reviewed by a writer named Molly Crabapple. The book is called "Here Where We Live Is Our Country," which was one of the slogans of the Bund, which was this non-Zionist or
Jewish organization.
Zionist Jewish organization in Europe that was started in the old Russian Empire, sort of reached its peak of influence in interwar Poland, kind of a combination, labor union, self-defense militia, cultural federation. They published a newspaper, and they felt Jews should fight for their rights wherever they were, and not immigrate to a homeland, because they were extremely well aware that there were also Arabs.
There are other people there
living there, which is the problem anywhere where you try to make a homeland.
Yes.
So, I was quite fascinated to learn about this non-Zionist or even at times anti-Zionist Jewish movement that had many, many adherents.
That's why it's so important to separate this. The false charge that being critical of expansionists and, frankly, genocidal and apartheid Israel, I'm Jewish, that's some kind of anti-Semitism is ridiculous. So in the time we have left, I want to get into the issue of inequality in American history. We're in a period of unfathomable income inequality. We're going to have the first trillionaires momentarily. I mean, it's outrageous. It's like a restoration of feudalism, you could say. But we've had periods of great inequality in American history before, and we did something about it. And then it went backwards, and then we did something about it again. So you've studied this. Would you start with the progressive era? Where would you start?
I think I'd start a little later, because the peak of inequality before the present moment, where, as you say, it really is the unparalleled. The previous peak, I believe, was 1928 or 1929.
Just before the stock market
Just
crashed.
before the stock market crashed. When, we think of the roaring 20s, well, they were roaring for the relatively small number of people who held stocks. And a lot of the rest of the population was really quite poor. Then what happened? The stock market crashed. The country was in dire straits. Franklin Roosevelt came to power. And we are so lucky that somebody like him came to power at that critical moment in this country. He was a good guy, and he was also pushed by social movements at the time.
Right.
There were people who were agitating for old age pensions, for unemployment insurance, for the right for labor unions to organize, to be better protected. And a lot happened in that decade which helped ease the inequality. It didn't omit it, But if you look at the figures, from the end of the 1930s on for several decades, the gap between both in wealth and income between the top 1% and everybody else really narrowed quite a bit. Economists call it the Great Compression.
Right.
And a lot of things contributed to that. There were somewhat steeper income and estate taxes under Roosevelt, not really stringent, but somewhat steeper. There was a quadrupling of people who belonged to labor unions.
Mm-hmm.
They won better wages for people. There was Social Security,
Right.
which meant that millions of people didn't run out of money when they had to stop working. So all of
Unemployment
those
insurance.
things, there was unemployment
That was
insurance.
his innovation.
So, we in a crude, incomplete way, we did something socially about that inequality, not eliminating it, not anywhere near as much as I would like to have seen, but quite a bit that lasted for a few decades. We're going to have to do something on a much larger scale now to make those trillionaires share that wealth.
Yeah, because they didn't create it by themselves.
Right, they
And
didn't.
by the way, I'm personally not in favor of total equality.
Right.
You need incentives, you need rewards. It's true, the right isn't wrong about that. They just overdo it. It's interesting when this whole right-wing nonsense about taxes on the wealthy. When taxes on the wealthy were very high,
Mm-hmm.
people would invest more in their workers and their factories rather than give the money to the government.
Yeah.
So it actually had a positive effect on the economy. There's so much mythology about this. But as you said, Roosevelt was pushed. I remember the famous story. He met with a bunch of activists and union leaders, and he said, I agree with you on everything. Now go out and make me do it.
Yes.
So that's what we have to do.
It is.
And that took a mass movement, and it's going to take that again. So you've written about mass movements. You wrote a book about the abolition movement against slavery in the UK and how they triumphed. It took them, 50 years or more?
Yeah.
And it was unthinkable that there could ever be anything but slavery to that society. But that movement came together and changed it. So how did they do it? And what are the lessons for today in the way slavery was overturned?
Well, I think there are a lot of lessons. One is that to accomplish something big can take a long time. The anti-slavery people, one of the most brilliant groups of community organizers ever.
This was in the UK.
In the UK, met for the first time in London in 1787. It was more than 50 years later, 1838, that the slaves of the British Empire, which meant basically the Caribbean islands, were freed. 51 years. Only one member of that original group was still alive to see it. And then it was another 50, 60, 70 years before the living conditions of those former to end slavery in the British Empire, which happened incidentally before slavery ended in the United States, took a long time. The Anti-Slavery Committee, I think one of the most brilliant groups of organizers ever in human history, met for the first time in London in 1787. The slaves of the British Empire were not freed until 1838, 51 years later.
Long fight.
Yeah, and this meant mainly people doing hard, backbreaking labor on sugar plantations in the British Caribbean islands. It took a long time. It took the development of all kinds of organizing techniques. There had never, for example, in Great Britain before that point, been an organization of people from different religious groups, different religious sects, working together for a secular aim, unheard of until that point. They invented the political poster, and you've probably seen representations of it. It's that diagram of a slave ship that shows the bodies packed together like sardines, a kind of top-down diagram. And
that was the first time people had to confront what the conditions were like.
This was before photography.
Right.
They realized, okay, something visual is a very important tool. They ran off 8,000 copies of this and put it up in pubs all over England. They sent copies to their friends, Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia and the Marquis de Lafayette in Paris. They invented the first logo for a political organization, showed a kneeling slave in chains and the legend around it, "Am I not a man and a brother?" A little bit later, women's anti-slavery movements got into the act and had their logo, a woman slave, and the legend, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" They had chapters all over the country. They lobbied Parliament. They put out leaflets. They realized for the first time that the way that you talk to people about an issue like this is not with biblical argument, which is what had previously been done, but with firsthand evidence. It was, in a way, the birth of investigative reporting.
Wow.
So it's a fascinating movement.
And it was a grassroots movement. It was all over the
It was
country.
a grassroots movement all over the country.
And they did good storytelling.
They did storytelling at the boycotts. There were 300,000 people in Britain at one point boycotting slave-grown sugar in the Caribbean.
That must have hurt.
So, there are a lot of lessons there for us, and I tried to tell it in my book, Bury the Chains. But I think one of the big lessons is coalition politics in every possible way. And don't expect to solve all the problems overnight.
So what would you say to people that are in the resistance of today? What should they know from history to guide them? What are some of the biggest mistakes that resistors make, and some of the that we need to make sure we avoid? I'll offer one, which would be dogmatism and rigid ideology on the left, which keeps you from forming those coalitions.
Absolutely. I totally agree. We need everybody in the coalition. We need never Trump Republicans. We need people on the left. We need liberals. We need religious people. We need secular people. We all have to work together. And we saw a pretty good instance of that in Minneapolis earlier this year, when tens of thousands of people turned out on the streets, often in below zero weather, to take food to immigrants who are afraid to leave their homes, to escort their children to school.
It was impressive.
2 people lost their lives in that effort. But I think they really helped cause a significant change of public opinion in this country.
Trump was forced to retreat.
Trump was forced to retreat, to change his tactics. I think we need to replicate that again and again and again.
The late Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, who was assassinated by the FBI.
Yeah.
He coined this term, rainbow coalition, to unite everybody against a common enemy. That's how you win. As you know, the left sometimes goes through these periods of dividing itself and attacking each other. I think we're coming out of one of those right now. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I do too. And I think we saw it on the streets in Minneapolis. We saw it in these No Kings marches, of which there will be more. And we have to be alert to every possible way in which we can form those coalitions, stay in touch with each other. I think there will be a lot of opportunities to work for good candidates this fall, and I hope people will do so. So I'm optimistic that with a lot of work, we can turn this thing around.
So it's the grimmest time of your political lifetime, but you're still optimistic that the basic institutions and values of the United States will hold in the end. Would you say that?
I think so. To me, it's not Germany in 1933, where the cloud was getting ever darker. Just look at the way public opinion has changed over Trump just since his second election.
Now, you've also studied and written about Joseph Stalin, and that's a kind of extreme authoritarianism and reign of terror and fear. Putin looks like a lightweight compared to Stalin.
That's true.
So these periods come in history that there's economic deprivation, there's propaganda. People rally around a strong man, a strong leader. This is part of Trump's appeal. You know, George Lakoff's formulation about the strict father morality of the right. Father's always right, and we all have to bend down to him. That's what goes on with Trump and his followers. So, do you think that we're going to see this again in the United States? Will we ever have more authoritarianism, or you think this is going to cure us of it?
I hope it will cure us of it. I can't promise it. I think it'll be a long time before we see another authoritarian leader who is as skillful a demagogue as Trump is, because he has somehow manipulated his own feelings of being a discriminated against outsider, the Queen's boy who was never quite accepted,
Wasn't smooth enough,
into an ability to identify with, the tens of millions of people in this country who feel similarly excluded and at a disadvantage, and to have them identify with him. And to have them identify with a billionaire, it's a remarkable feat.
and a con man,
And a con man.
and a liar, and a cheat.
And a convicted criminal. I think it's going to be a long time before anybody can duplicate that feat.
He's a cult leader, basically.
Yeah.
Cults don't last.
Yeah.
And of course, as you know, studying these periods in history, fascist periods never last because no one will tell the leader that they're wrong.
Right.
And if no one's going to tell you you have no clothes on, Mr. Emperor, guess what? You're going to make a cascading series of errors,
Right.
which is Trump and Iran.
Absolutely.
Everybody knew they were going to close the Straits of
Yeah.
Hormuz. I
Yeah.
mean, how did he not know? Because
Yeah.
people around him are afraid to tell him the truth.
Yeah.
So this is what happens. Of course, Stalin, how many people did Stalin kill? What's the estimate?
They have downgraded the estimate of outright executions. That's now said to be a mere 800,000 or so. But the number of people who died in the Gulag, nobody knows, because those figures are buried
In
deep
the
in
prison
Soviet-
system,
But it's well into the millions, possibly 10 million or more. We don't know, and we probably never will really know. But I think also, Russia never had that history of a kind of ornery in-your-faceness that Americans have. Americans are accustomed to saying what they think to people.
Freedom's the national religion.
It is. And, I think that it would be a long time before a Stalin could ever really succeed in this country.
Boy, let's hope so.
Yeah.
So another movement that you and I were involved in, because you're a journalist and a historian, but you're also an activist, was the movement that succeeded in getting rid of apartheid in South Africa. And this was personal for you because, as you wrote eloquently, your father ran a mining company that maintained mines in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and with horrible conditions.
Yeah.
And as you came of age and realized this, it set you on
Zambia.
Oh, in Zambia. Sorry,
actually,
right.
Yeah.
And this helped set you on your path. And a mass movement did emerge around the world to overthrow apartheid and in South Africa. So what can we learn from that movement?
I think the same thing is from the British anti-slavery movement. It took a long time. I mean, they were at it for almost a century. It took strikes, demonstrations, sit-ins, boycotts, embargoes. The pressure from overseas really helped. And then finally, there came a breakthrough. But it didn't happen suddenly. It took a long time. A lot of people died in that process. In some ways, in terms of real economic justice, the goals have still not been met. It's still an immensely unequal society. But it's a democratic society. It has a functioning justice system. And I think, I certainly, I made my first trip to South Africa, when I was a teenager, and I certainly never thought I would live to see South Africa under majority rule. So looking at an example like that makes me think it can be done. Also, here in the United States, when I was growing up, Black people in the American South could not vote.
No.
We did affect some change there. We had a two-term Black president. We've got a Supreme Court that's rolling back the Voting Rights Act, but we still do have Black voters in the South, as we long have had in the North. So I think there's some progress there too, but all these things take a long time, and they're always vulnerable to being rolled back.
Yeah, the Supreme Court got rid of Black representation before, at the end of Reconstruction,
Right.
in the 1800s. It's saying the same things, by the way. They actually say, well, we haven't had slavery in 13 years. What are these people complaining about? And now, under the name of equality and non-discrimination, they're eliminating Black representation in the Congress. It's outrageous.
It really is.
But these fights are forever, basically. The powerful get more money and more power. They use it to corrupt the democracy and get their way. And then a resistance movement comes against it. And I think, personally, we're going to have another one soon against the concentration of power and wealth from AI and throwing people out of work.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And, we can take heart from something that happened in Europe recently, which was the end of Orban's rule in Hungary.
That was great.
Which was a tremendous boost, I think, for the forces of democracy worldwide. That here was a guy who, operating in what was at the time an open society, freedom of the press, and democracy, votes, and so on, basically created a Trump-like state with himself in charge and he and his cronies benefiting financially from it. And he was voted out.
He
despite
tried to control the media. Actually controlled a lot of media.
Yeah. And Trump was backing him all the way, sent Vance over there at the last minute.
A lot of the American right was backing him.
When the election happened, I wrote to some Hungarian friends to congratulate them, and one of them wrote back, said, "Thanks for sending Vance. It helped."
So let's just talk about the media a little bit again. You're a journalist. You've been teaching at the University of California, Berkeley Journalism School for many years. You played a major role in starting one of the most important alternative publications in America, Mother Jones. Why did you do that?
Well, at the time we started talking about Mother Jones, it was 1974. The magazine was finally started in 76. That was an exhilarating era for anybody who cared about journalism, because in 1974, Nixon was forced to step down, and he was forced to step down because of a series of revelations that two bold investigative journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, had made at the Washington Post. What we found at Mother Jones, once the magazine got started, was that nobody was really directing investigative journalism at corporations. And that has become a major theme of Mother Jones over the years. This year is the 50th anniversary of Mother Jones.
Congratulations.
Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Center for Investigative Reporting, which Mother Jones recently merged with. And it's amazing and delightful to me to see that the magazine is still there. I haven't worked there for many years. I write for it occasionally. I respect very much what they do. It still, in addition to everything else, in addition to a website, Instagram feed, Facebook pages, and so on, it still is a print magazine with the largest circulation it's ever had, well over 200,000.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, people want good information. Look at podcasting. People will listen to podcasts for 2-3 hours at a time. I think the idea that all people want is 30-second videos is very overstated. So the mainstream media, that certainly the television media, has declined terribly.
It has.
again, dating ourselves, we used to be upset with the coverage on the evening news. Oh, how can this be? And now when you look back, Walter Cronkite and CBS News, like that was the golden age, even with all of its mistakes. It wasn't, pandering to the lowest common denominator. And most importantly, it was not set up to be a profit center for the corporations that owned it. In fact, the ethos was, we don't care about profits in the news, we care about public service. It's hard to imagine, right? But television news is kind of dying. Many newspapers, local newspapers are dying.
Absolutely.
Local coverage is dying. Sure, the New York Times is successful, but it's only 10 million subscribers. So thank God Mother Jones is there, and people really should support independent journalism. It's incredibly important. So tell me, the students that you teach in journalism, what's different about them today compared to when you started?
Well, as a teacher, I have to say one of my frustrations is they don't read as much as they used to. I mean, when I first started teaching there, the first class I taught, I assigned a book a week. I could never get away with doing that now. That frustrates me, but I do find many of them really care passionately about using the tools of journalism to make a better world. A number of them have gone into investigative journalism. A former student of mine won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of weeks ago for work she did at the San Francisco Chronicle. I take pride in that. I think our school can take pride in that. But the part of the problem is that the traditional journalistic organizations of all kinds have shrunk. Several thousand newspapers have gone out of business. TV networks and stations and so on have reduced their news staffs. So there are fewer jobs for these often very talented students to go to. So some of them are starting podcasts, some of them are starting websites. I mean, I don't think it's a mixed picture, because on the one hand, I despair that there are, tens of thousands of fewer paying jobs for journalists in the country today than there were, as recently as 25 or 30 years ago. On the other hand, in all these different forms, websites, podcasts, so on, it seems like there is a richer and more diverse array of opinions out there for those who want to seek them.
But it's hard to seek them.
It is hard.
And these algorithms don't reward necessarily truth. They reward sensationalism and conflict. I think over the next couple of decades, Americans are going to have to face a conflict between the First Amendment, which is sacrosanct, but it's not absolute. The notion that we should leave Mark Zuckerberg and artificial intelligence to determine what people get to find out or not. Who was the famous writer that said freedom of the press belongs to those who own one?
A.J. Liebling
from the New Yorker. So, we do have a problem. I mean, take climate change. So, only 50% of the public believes that humans are changing the climate. And, on television news, which, by the way, is still very strong on TikTok. On TikTok, the leading news sites are all ABC, NBC, CBS. You could have the worst hurricanes every day, and they won't tell you that burning fossil fuels is causing this. People don't really know. And it's a very low priority issue for people because they don't hear about it very much. And it's, threat. One of my beefs with take the New York Times is in the business section, they'll report all these deals for more oil drilling, liquefied natural gas exports, and never once said, oh, this will put New York underwater. They won't ever say it. It's just physics. So it's really out of sight and out of mind. It's kind of ostrich behavior.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to work on that.
We will. We will. I mean, there's sort of several models here. I think we grew up with the model of the print newspaper that landed on your doorstep that purported to tell you what was going on in the world.
All the news that fits the print.
And that, you know, sometimes did a halfway decent job of that. The model today is your feed. And your feed, of course, is adjusted according to, you know, what the algorithms say about what kinds of stories you want to read.
It's your filter bubble.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really good for democracy to have people in all these little bubbles.
Right.
And nor is it, of course, good that people are exposed to all this intentional falsehood, like on Fox News, where the business model is intentional falsehood.
Yes.
Knowing intentional falsehood, which is why I gag anytime anybody calls it news.
Yes.
It's not
Yes.
news.
It should be called the Fox Turret or something.
How about the Fox falsehoods of today?
Yeah.
So, well, Adam, thank you very much for being on the Fenton Forecast. You know, I think, you know, history does repeat itself in some ways, but in the end, you know, the motto of our show, the Fenton Forecast, is the future is up to us.
Yeah.
So we can make history intentionally, and it's important to learn from it. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, David. And let's hope it's the good parts of history that repeat themselves.
For sure. Okay, thank you.
Power